Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about the first component of an essay, the introduction. So in this lesson, we're looking at the purpose of an essay, having an overarching understanding of our objectives in the creation of an academic essay at this level. We'll look at the purpose of the introduction, the first paragraph in an essay. Then we'll look at the last sentence of that introduction, the thesis statement, and start examining some of the criteria that lend themselves to the creation of a positive or strong thesis statement. Then we'll actually break down the introduction into its various different components, and we'll go over some guidelines from the Heritage College Handbook or English guidebook in order to better understand how we approach the development of an introduction. And lastly, we'll take a look at some other sample introductions to better understand how we can tweak or evolve weak thesis statements into stronger thesis statements. First, the purpose of an essay. An essay exists to develop and prove a logical, coherent argument. Remember that when you're writing your essay, what you're trying to do in the end is to convince me of something. Not something personal that you believe per se, but something about the story. Perhaps you believe the story is conveying some kind of message. It's making an argument. Your job in an essay then would be to say, here's what the story is arguing, or what the author is arguing through the story, or here are the techniques that he uses to develop that argument. Likewise, if you're making an argument about an essay, you would be articulating the argument that he makes in that essay, the author makes in that essay, and then discussing the techniques that he uses to persuade his audience to accept them. The essay has to be structured logically and coherently. Everything inside the essay has to build point by point, example by example, both with respect to the introduction, the body paragraphs, and then conclusion, right? The various different paragraphs in the essay, and also with respect to each sentence in the work. As you build the paragraph, you're thinking about, here's what I'm saying in one sentence, and here's what I have to lead into in the next sentence, so that every sentence logically leads into the next. There are no gaps or holes between each sentence and between each paragraph. Everything develops the argument logically, step by step, point by point. And we're going to be returning to that idea again and again as we talk about every different aspect and element of structure and argumentation in an academic essay. The essay also has to answer the essay question posed by your teacher, obviously. So when you're writing, keep in mind the question that you're being asked, because ultimately everything you do in that essay has to be oriented around addressing that topic and proving your answer to that question. The introduction is, well, the first paragraph of your essay that introduces it. In that introduction, your objective is to introduce your subject. It's to give your reader an idea of what it is you're going to be talking about in general terms, then the story that you're going to be talking about and its relationship to that general idea, and then lastly, and most importantly, your argument or your thesis statement. The thesis statement is just the argument of your essay, the thing that the rest of the essay is going to try to prove. You use the introduction to set up for and introduce the terms and ideas that you need to set up your introduction or to set up your thesis statement. The thesis or the thesis statement, the statement of your argument, is the last sentence in your introduction. Your essay is going to try to prove this thesis statement. And it has to be several things. It has to be clear. In other words, you can't leave your reader with any questions. Make sure that your thesis statement uses clear and precise language. It has to be specific. So don't talk in generalities like this story has a theme of love. That's incredibly general. What is this story saying about love? Maybe love is an inherently irrational emotion and so has to be controlled in order to ensure that people don't destroy themselves. That is a clear and specific argument. It has to be direct. So don't circle around the argument. You want to state it as directly and as concisely as possible. Use as few words as are necessary to convey the totality of your argument. And then lastly, it has to be an argument and not an observation. It has to be an argument and not a fact. In answering the essay question, you have to stake a claim. So you can't say something like, well, love can produce positive actions and negative actions. You're not staking a claim. You're not really making an argument. You're saying something that's objectively true. We know love sometimes leads to good things and love sometimes leads to bad things. So you're not really putting yourself out there and making an argument. Make sure that the thesis is actually an argument. As an example of a poor thesis, dealing with Charles Dickens' novel, Hard Times. And because it is a novel, we have it in italics. As we've talked about before, play titles And the titles of novels are in italics. Also, film titles are in italics. Short stories and poems are in quotation marks. So, poor thesis. There are many points of connection between Charles Dickens' Hard Times and our society. What we have here is a thesis that is vague. It's not specific. What are these points of connection? Can you find one specific point of connection and show why that's important? That should be in your thesis. This is far too broad. It's not really an argument. It's not saying that here's what Dickens is saying and here's how it's relevant to our society. It's just saying there are similarities between the two. That's not really even an argument. And the last problem, or the last major problem with this thesis, is that it uses the first person, R. In an essay, you can never use the first person, I, we, me, R, and you can never use the second person, you. You have to find ways to write around that by saying things like maybe and contemporary society, or contemporary American or Canadian society. Or instead of saying that we often find this, people often find, etc., etc. A passable version of that kind of thesis involving Hard Times. In Hard Times, Charles Dickens condemns his society's education system. Now, there are good things and bad things about this thesis, and that is actually a terrible thesis, what I just said there, right? But for our purposes, it is an argument, right? He condemns his society's education system. Okay. And it's clear. I know exactly what you're going to be talking about in this essay, and the sentence itself makes complete sense. It's fluid and logical. The problem here is that it's still not specific. What, per se, is wrong with the education system? What is it about the education system or its results, how it impacts people? What is it that Charles Dickens condemns it for? So I need more details, more specificity in this thesis statement, right? He condemns it as being ineffective. Okay, ineffective in what way? He condemns it because of how it's structured. He condemns it because of what undergirds it, the values that undergird it. He condemns it because of the kind of people it produces. You need to take one of those ideas and follow through with it in specific detail. So let's say we take the idea that, well, he doesn't like the products, the kind of people that are produced by this education system. That in itself would be a little bit better, would add detail to this thesis. But we want to expand that idea. We want to be as precise as possible. So the more than passable thesis would be, in Hard Times, Charles Dickens condemns his society's education system as its focus on practicality produces emotionally and morally stunted people. Now there is a great thesis. I have what he's doing. He's condemning this education system. I have what the education system does wrong. It focuses on practicality. And, well, the consequences of that, it produces emotionally and morally stunted people. So I have the reason why he condemns it and the kind of consequence of the education system that he is condemning or decrying. So everything is checked off here. All the boxes are checked off. We have an argument. It is clear, direct, concise, and specific. So as a review from the Heritage College Handbook, or the guide, the thesis of an essay is a complete sentence that identifies the main argument that you intend to prove. Appearing as the final sentence of your introductory paragraph, it should be a firm declarative statement that puts forth a defensible position that you'll argue. So, some guidelines for the thesis statement. Offer a rationale. In relation to a topic, try to answer why, how, in what way, or to present a cause and effect analysis. Cause and effect statements are oftentimes strong arguments. Consider what's the cause, an education system that is focused on practicality, and what is the effect? Well, it produces people who are emotionally and morally stunted. Make sure that your thesis is not a question. What is the impact of Charles Dickens' education system, or the education in Charles Dickens' era? You don't want your thesis statement to be a question. You want it to be a direct, declarative, argumentative statement. Now, your thesis should be supported by three distinct major ideas. There should be three things, three core insights or observations that you can discuss from the story that you're reading or the story that you're discussing, that you can use to support that thesis. As you develop the essay and its thesis have to be supported by evidence and proof. Every essay needs quotations. If you cannot find quotations in the text to support your argument, or if the argument is rooted in the hypothetical, like could have, would have, or should have, instead of what is, your thesis has to be rethought. As you're developing your thesis, you're looking at the text, you're engaging with it, you're reviewing the examples and the things we've discussed in class, the things you've highlighted and underlined in the story, in order to say, here's what the story is saying, here's how this thesis can be supported. Avoid using overly general and broad language. Terms like interesting, important, positive, and negative. That's true in both the thesis and the rest of the essay. It doesn't matter what's interesting. It matters what is being conveyed. So when you're introducing a quotation or introducing an idea, you don't want to tell me that it's interesting or it's important. Tell me in specific exact terms why it's important. So rather than saying it's important, Bitzer becomes a horrible criminal. Bitzer is one of the characters in Hard Times. And he is a product of this education system. He's only concerned about what is utilitarian, what is practical. And so when he believes that he can obtain advancement in his career through theft and through duplicity, he does so because he's been sort of morally stunted by the education system of his age. So you don't want to say, well, it's important that Bitzer becomes a thief. You want to say Bitzer is an example of the results or the morally stunting results of the education system, as et cetera, et cetera. You go on to explain that. What's important generally isn't important. The specific key insight and direct analysis or interpretation is. So some common errors in thesis statements. Do not use thesis statements that are too broad. In Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour, women are oppressed. Why are women oppressed? What is it that's wrong with the oppression of women? That might seem obvious to you as it does to me, but right, you also have to make this kind of idea specific and explicit in your thesis statement. Another example of a poor thesis statement that's too broad, it's not specific enough. Literacy in our culture is decaying or declining. Why? How? What is the consequence of that? Do not use thesis statements that are too narrow or statements of fact. In Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour, Mr. Millard is believed to be dead. That's just a statement of fact about the story. It doesn't matter that he's believed to be dead. If I read the story, I know that. Your essay is striving to tell the reader something that wouldn't be clear to them based on just a reading through of the story, something that isn't immediately obvious based on plot. A thesis that is too narrow results in a statement that tends to be factual in nature and therefore cannot be argued. Do not use thesis statements that contain more than one idea. Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour explores the wife's lack of freedom and the husband's lack of awareness. On the one hand, you have a very weak verb here, explores. What does it matter that it explores it? You're not really arguing anything. You're just saying the story is about the wife's lack of freedom and the husband's lack of awareness. Right? You're not really making an argument there. And one of the reasons for that, in this case, is that you have two ideas, one that's about the husband and one that's about the wife, and they don't mix together. If you said that perhaps ignorance or socially imposed ignorance, as in the husband's lack of awareness, creates the social situation that leads to the oppression of women. Whoa, now you've taken these two ideas and made them one thing, a cause and effect. And it's a specific argument about what the story is saying regarding how women are treated. Do not use announcements of topic disguised as thesis statements. So in an introduction, introduce your topic, what it is you're talking about very early on in the introduction. Your last sentence, the thesis, is the specific argument you're making about that topic. So an example of a thesis statement that does not do that it's poor because it announces the topic. It just says, this essay is going to be about X. You never want to say that. You want to have that clear, specific, focused argument. This essay will look at the treatment of women in Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. Never write this essay will look at or this essay will examine. You want to have a clear and specific argument. Right? Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour condemns the treatment of women that is based on stereotypical perceptions of their intellectual inferiority. Now, there's an argument. Here, there's a statement of topic the essay will look at, et cetera, et cetera. You never want to have that. Or in the following paper, again, never write that, the decline of literacy will be discussed. You're just telling me what the general overarching topic is. You haven't given me an argument. That's not a thesis. The introduction appears immediately after your title. This introduction follows a logical developmental process that essentially moves from most general to most specific. And rather than reading through this section, which you'll be able to do on your own time because you have this handout for you in Omnivox, we're going to take a look at the introduction at a glance, because thinking about it in general terms helps to, I think, solidify what the introduction's purpose is and what it looks like in practice. An introduction is kind of like an inverted triangle, where at the top or broadest part of the triangle, you have your most general statement. And then sentence by sentence, logically connecting each sentence to the next, you move to the most specific tip of the spear, as it were, the thesis statement, where you state your argument directly. In this standard basic introductory 7-sentence introduction for a introduction to college English class, your first sentence provides a general statement about your topic. So if your topic is about love or the like, you would introduce the subject of love. Your second sentence develops that idea in your first sentence. Now, that might be defining necessary key terms. It doesn't always have to be. It can just be an expansion of that first idea and the implications of that first sentence. The third sentence takes the idea, the subject of your first two sentences, love, and ties it into this text. Right? Let's say we're talking about Romeo and Juliet. Love leads Romeo and Juliet to essentially betray their family, their heritage, and to enter into this, well, disastrous suicide pact, where they kill each other for the love they have for the person they believe is dead. So you're just describing the story in very general terms, but connecting the plot of the story and the ideas of the story in that one sentence to the subject. How is that subject relevant to the story that you've chosen to deal with? So in this sentence, the third sentence, you introduce the topic in relation to the text, and you provide me the title of the text, Romeo and Juliet, and the author, Shakespeare. In the next three sentences, you provide main ideas. These are like major supporting points or supporting arguments for your thesis statement. We'll talk more about main ideas when we discuss body paragraphs. But the major idea is like a supporting argument. So if my thesis was something like, well, Star Trek is better than Star Wars, which it is, but that's something for another day. Star Trek is better than Star Wars. Okay. These three main ideas would be three reasons why Star Trek is better than Star Wars. Maybe it's because Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard in Star Trek, is a Shakespearean trained actor. Maybe it's because Star Trek explores complex philosophical issues that Star Wars does not. Maybe the third main idea is that Star Trek has more robust and complex characters. Okay, so those would be three reasons why my thesis, Star Trek is better than Star Wars. Now, in an academic essay and an introduction at this level, we're not arguing matters of taste or perception. We're generally arguing issues of meaning, what the story is trying to say. So here's a very simplistic sample introduction. Just to illustrate these 7 sentences, I'm going to be expecting more than this kind of introduction as we go on and we look at examples that I provide you. But this example serves to illustrate, or illustrates, I should say, this introduction structure. So that first sentence, wherein I provide a general statement about the topic. From the moment of birth, men and women are typically socialized to adhere to specific gender roles. So I've introduced my topic about men, women, and gender roles. Second sentence, where I expand on that idea or I define key terms. Gender can be defined as the roles and characteristics assigned to men and women in society. Comment 3, which introduces the topic in relation to text. So now I've got this idea about gender roles. I'm going to go take the story that I want to talk about, the author that I want to talk about, and I'm going to tie those two things into the subject. In this case, the 7-sentence introduction has become an 8-sentence introduction because I've continued this idea of comment 2, defining key terms. Unlike sex, the biological difference that distinguishes men and women, gender is socially constructed and can lead to problematic consequences when treated as determined by a person's sex. Then I move into that connection to the text itself. Alice Munro explores these consequences in her short story, Boys and Girls. So I've just basically described the story and give it a brief summary. I would probably expand this idea of explores the consequences. Explores the consequences is very vague. I'd probably talk about one of the characters or how they deal with gender roles. The male and female characters of the story, here's my first main idea, where I begin to discuss a supporting point that's going to help build into and support my thesis. The male and female characters in the story are divided in terms of their labor. Additionally, the physical spaces they occupy are distinct. And third main idea, the expected behavior of men and women is also segregated along gender lines. Then the thesis that's going to be supported by the exploration of these three main ideas. Munro ultimately demonstrates how enforced gender roles divide the male and female characters in the story. Now, for me, that thesis is pretty weak. It's weak because it's not specific. She demonstrates how enforced gender roles divide the male and female characters. How does it divide them? What are the consequences of dividing them? It doesn't lead to, or it doesn't offer a cause and effect argument. Likewise, it doesn't say, well, she's condemning this division, and it's not dealing with the real world, it's dealing with the story. So what does it matter that the characters are divided in the story? What she's really saying, or what she's really arguing, is that there's a division in the real world that she's articulating and condemning through the presentations of these characters in her story. So there are a number of flaws with this sample introduction, but the key takeaway would be the purposes of these various different key sentences in the introduction, the structure of the introduction. What I have here is a sample thesis statement for the story, The Flying Machine by Ray Bradbury. We're going to go through several sample thesis statements, and I'm going to essentially tear them down. I'm going to say what works well in those thesis statements and what needs to be improved. So a sample thesis statement. A leader has many responsibilities, some of them arguably immoral, but beneficial for the greater good. You have a solid idea here about a kind of thematic argument, right? But it could refocus the argument to make it more forceful and direct. It seems more like an observation rather than an argument, right? Right? It's literally factually true that a leader has many responsibilities, and some of those responsibilities might lead him to do things that are immoral. Right? Beneficial for the greater good really means either for the greater good or beneficial for his people. Right? Beneficial for the greater good literally means that the greater good benefits. So when you're writing, think about what you're actually saying. Sometimes words and phrases can come across as very clear in our minds because, well, we're the ones who are writing them. We know what we want to say. But do the words that we have put on the page actually resulted, or have they actually resulted, in the articulation of the idea that we wanted to express? Beneficial for the greater good literally means that the greater good as a thing is, well, being benefited. That's clearly not what the author of this sentence wanted to say. He wanted to say that these immoral responsibilities are beneficial for his people, right? Or that it's necessary because it's for the greater good, or there for the greater good. So an amended thesis that includes the title of the story, as you should. In this case, because we're dealing with a short story, the title is in quotation marks. According to the Flying Machine, part of a good leader's responsibilities is to be ready to commit immoral actions in order to benefit his people. Oh, now that's an argument, an arguable point. It's clear, specific, and direct. That issue of language here has been cleared up. A strong thesis statement. Ray Bradbury's story here, The Flying Machine, another thesis engaging with it. Bradbury's story has many themes attached to it, one of which is leaders' responsibilities to society. The emperor has to be responsible when dealing with any situation. In the story, he has to choose what is right to execute a man who may reveal his secret. The story makes you feel something for the man and share the tough choice of leader. What we have here is a wide array of ideas, and it's an illustration of that the point that I raised earlier on, wherein you have several sentences that don't really lead one to the next, and there's no concrete cohesive argument. First of all, Bradbury's story has many themes attached to it. That's the worst kind of thesis statement, in that it's saying here are many things. There are many things. It's far too broad. It's far too general. There's also a kind of summary of what's going on in the story, and you don't want that in your thesis statement. Your thesis statement has to be a single focused sentence. Then it leads into, from this idea about the emperor's responsibilities, to the idea that it makes you feel something for the man. There's no real thesis statement that evolves out of this point. Pause this video now to review my comments on this thesis statement. The same thing here with this slide. You can review my comments here about this thesis statement. Taking everything that was said in that sample thesis and condensing it down, boiling it all down to the core insight that seems to be there. Ray Bradbury's The Flying Machine argues that leaders should be willing to make immoral decisions to help their people. That's an argument. It could be expanded, it could be developed further, but taking the raw material of this statement here about these myriad ideas about empathizing for the leader and the leader being presented as sympathetic even though he's doing something wrong, because what he's doing, murdering a man essentially, is done to protect his people and the hundreds of thousands of people in his kingdom. That presents it as the correct thing, if not the moral thing. We can say that Ray Bradbury's The Flying Machine argues that leaders should be willing to make immoral decisions to help their people. Keep in mind those key tenets of a thesis statement, that you should be clear, specific, direct, arguable, concise, and a direct answer to, or you should provide a direct answer to the essay question.